Hi, I'm Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm here with my April wrap up, and this is a rare feat of timeliness because it's actually still April. What it has in timeliness, it may lack in in-depth discussion because I've just realised I have a very short time before I have to head out. So I will see if I can race through these books, but I have to say some of them I think need a bit more time. So I'm not sure how we'll go about this, but I may have to cut it short and come back and do a part 2, something like that. So the first one is New Animal by Ella Baxter. So I read this as part of Aussie April and really glad I did. I loved this. I was saying to Annie, I feel like this is the millennial book I've been waiting for, in that it is just strong, a distinctive voice, fresh, but actually really focused on the characters and the story and keeping you entertained and not so much trying to be something or trying to be self-consciously, writing and that sort of thing. It just gets straight into it. So this is about Amelia. I think I've spoken about it on my Aussie April check-in, so maybe I'll put a link to that down below that will make this quicker. But Amelia is a cosmetician at her family's mortuary business. So lots of trigger warnings for death in all of its forms for this one. But she has a mother and a stepfather who are both involved in the business, and then something happens to her mum, and so she ends up going to Tasmania to stay with her biological father, Jack. And so it's just about her life and her sort of coming of age or coming to terms with things that she's been grappling with, including something that happened to her friend Daniel the year before. Whilst in Tasmania, she also gets involved in the kink community, and it's just wonderfully unadorned, authentic, fresh, quite funny, dryly funny in parts, and poignant as well, and I really loved it. So I'm highly recommending this. That's New Animal by Ella Baxter. Then I can't remember which order I read these, but also Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. So this is a novel by a trans author, Torrey Peters. So we have Ames in New York, I think it is. Ames and his girlfriend Katrina, and Katrina falls pregnant, and Ames isn't sure if he's ready to be a father, but he does want to be involved as a parent if he can have some participation of a trans friend. And so he chooses his ex-girlfriend Reese, who is a trans woman. But Ames also, when he was with Reese, was a woman, Amy. So he had been born as a boy and then transitioned into a woman called Amy, and Amy and Reese were together, but wasn't comfortable in their skin and still wasn't comfortable as a woman, and detransitioned to become Ames, hence the title, Detransition Baby. And so he thinks it would be a great idea if Reese would come on board as a third parent. And Reese has always wanted to have children and is very maternal, very clucky, and in that sense is tempted by the idea, but also, as the reader is saying to him, are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? This is the worst idea you've ever come up with. And so it's very real and very, you read along as the characters are processing these events, you're sort of sharing that with them. And so you get a lot of their inner thoughts. So in that sense, it's quite immersive, a bit like Fleischman is in Trouble, that really blow by blow, sort of what people are thinking as they walk along the street, sort of fly on the wall experience. And of course quite New York in that way. It's a real immersion into trans life. So I loved that it was very upfront about that, and it doesn't try to over-explain anything. And so for me, that was quite eye-opening as a straight reader who hasn't had much experience with that community. So I really appreciated that. And I think it's a book of great generosity, because I think Torrey Peters has given us a lot in this book, a lot of sharing, a lot of experiences of what it's like as a trans person. And I
feel like that's a really generous thing that she's done for a wider audience. For me, I didn't love it as a novel in the sense that the style was quite wordy at times, and so I felt like it was longer than it needed to be. But that's sort of nitpicking, and that's a personal taste sort of thing. But a really interesting book to read, and so I'm recommending this. I'd be interested to know if you've read it, what you thought. That was Detransition Baby. And then Hot Stew by Fiona Mozley. So this is her follow-up novel after her Booker shortlisted novel Elmet, which I never read, and I still want to get to it. But because it was on my radar, and then I hadn't quite got to read it, so I was really excited to read Hot Stew, which is a very different, I gather, quite a different novel. But this is set in London. It's a melting pot of characters, but all centred around Soho, and there's a apartment block that's set to be redeveloped by the sort of evil landowner Agatha, who's an heiress and owns lots of properties and is some sort of billionaire, and she wants to, she's gentrifying the area essentially, and so it pits the sort of good versus bad in quite an overblown, hyper-real style, where in the apartment block we have the pub and the sort of barflies, the guys who hang out at the pub all day. We have a brothel. We meet two of the sex workers, Tabitha and Precious. We have, I'm forgetting some of the characters. There are some homeless people who are squatters in the basement there, and so we meet them. So there's lots and lots of characters. So it's not a novel where you fall in with one character and follow their story and really come to love them and feel for them towards the end. It's more jumping from one to the other, but getting an impression of London and the sort of underbelly of London and the themes about homelessness and poverty and how we treat people and how we, the history of London as well, and the character of it and the streets and buildings and how they form part of the fabric. So I really enjoyed it. I didn't love it, but I thought it was really easy to read and a very London sort of book, which I loved. So that was Hot Stew by Fiona Mozley. Next up, back to Aussie April with Growing Up Disabled in Australia, edited by Carly Findlay, and this was excellent. I really recommend this. It's a collection of essays about growing up disabled in Australia, and one of the themes of this book is that if you are disabled, there's what we often think of as disabled, and we often come to that with a medical point of view of, well, yes, you're disabled because you can't walk, therefore you're in a wheelchair, or because you can't hear or you can't see, and it's what they call the medical model of disability. And this book promotes the social model, which is to say that disabled people are part of their being disabled comes from not having access to things like buildings or activities because society excludes them because of the way society is structured, and that if it could be more inclusive, they wouldn't be as affected by their disability or by their medical condition. The other thing that's really interesting is the way that disability encompasses a lot of different ailments and conditions and things that are not always visible, and the different forms of discrimination that those people face because people in society can't always see that they're suffering from a disability and hurry them along up the stairs or things like that. One of the beautiful things about these essays, a lot of them talk about the author's hopes or dreams or things they want to do in life, or areas that they want to succeed in, or things they're interested in, whether it be singing or gardening or writing or acting or whatever it might be, and really brings home the idea that everybody has those hopes or dreams, and the disability is really, it's only one thing about them, and whereas a lot of us see someone with a disability and we feel like that defines them, and it's easy for that to be to appear to be the defining thing. And of course, as a result of that, they are discriminated against in other ways. So you might have a teacher who has really low expectations of their disabled student, which will hold them back because the teacher thinks, well, that's all that you'll be capable of, because all they see is the condition or the disability. So I really loved this, and the essays are very well written, really entertaining in parts as well, sometimes quite funny. So I enjoyed it, but also learnt a lot from it. So I recommend that. That's Growing Up Disabled in Australia. So I am out of time. I'm going to have to come back for part 2, so I will see you shortly. Hi, I'm back. Apologies for that short break. So I have 2 more books that I read in April, and they are No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, which ironically a lot of people have been talking about because I think it's longlisted for the Women's Prize, and the shortlist is coming out soon. So I feel like as I record this, the shortlist is out any day now, late April. But in any case, people are talking about this. It's her first novel, I believe, but she wrote a memoir called Priest Daddy, which was very highly regarded, which I haven't read yet, but got a lot of buzz a year or 2 ago. And so this is set in the United States, and it's an unnamed protagonist, a woman who lives in this surreal world of celebrity, online celebrity, where one of her posts went viral, and the post was, "Can a dog be twins?" So it really skewers the sort of inane sort of things that take off and become trends on social media, and just the world that we live in at the moment. And it's a novel really in 2 parts, where in the first half it's a series of fragments of her life, and without being a story as such or really ever cohering, or she has a stream of consciousness that changes as her attention span is quite short, and that reflects the world that she's spending most of her time in, which is the online world, where trends come and go really quickly and things are so ephemeral, and something that's so important that everyone's reading one day or everyone's talking about one week will be past, old news by the next week. And it's that hustle and that sort of race to keep up constantly and to stay relevant and to be on in touch with things and not to be offending people and so on. And she captures that really, really well. And whilst she's doing it, she skims over issues such as things that are happening in her marriage or her life that she barely notices, and big world issues like climate change that she notices but then moves on to something else, which does, I think, reflect how we cope or don't cope or address those sorts of issues, where we sort of acknowledge them and we'll post something on social media or we'll read a post on social media, but then what do we do beyond that, And then the interesting thing that Patricia Lockwood does is the second half of the novel, the protagonist, it really delves into one issue, which is when her family faces a crisis, and that draws her back very much into the real world, and all that social media, all the online world seems to just recede and it doesn't matter. And so it puts things into perspective for her in a very sort of sudden way. And so her family faces this crisis, which she travels to her hometown to be with them and to help deal with that. And that brings up all sorts of different issues, for example, the healthcare system in the States and other things. And so they are political things, but it's also very much a personal story as it affects her, and it feels more like a novel in that sense. But I thought that was done very effectively. I think the writing is incredible. Patricia Lockwood's writing is so poetic at times and really on point. It's quite a zeitgeisty kind of novel. I did feel when I was reading the first half that it could have almost been non-fiction, and it almost read like and some people have described it like a extended Twitter highlights or best of, or, you know, just a really, really good series of Twitter posts or something like that. And it almost reads like it could have been that and then adapted to make it sound more like a fiction. But I think there is a method in that madness, because it shows by implication and by hinting at it how we are distracted, and whether we're really focusing on the right things and whether we're engaging in life. Or it certainly shows for this character how she comes of age and matures to a point where she's participating more in life as opposed to skimming on the surface of it. But also with the social media, it also does show that sense of community that people get from being online. So it covers a lot of ground, and it's tightly written because it's quite short. So I loved that as well. So I'm recommending that. I'm talking about it with Annie this week on the podcast, so I can't wait to hear her thoughts. So that was No One Is Talking About This, which we are talking about. And then I've just finished today, so I'm still digesting Mrs. Death by Salena Godden. And this is a story of Wolf, who's a writer, and they meet Death in the form of an older woman called Mrs. Death. And so Mrs. Death becomes their muse in a way and tells them stories about people who've died in London or in England over the years, over the course of history. And Wolf then sets about writing either a memoir of Mrs. Death or a novel or some form of writing. I'm not sure. We don't know what exactly, because it takes different forms. There's poetry, there's memoir, there's almost short stories within a story. And so the style jumps around quite a lot. And so as a whole, as a novel, for me, it didn't quite cohere, but I really sort of respect what Salena Godden's doing, because it made me think of Olivia Laing, who said at a interview that I saw her speak in once, that with everything that's going on at the moment and in the current world that we live in and the way things are, and, you know, talking about Twitter and things like that, which does make me think of the Patricia Lockwood, it doesn't seem enough it's hard to describe that or to express that in a traditional novel. That just feels stale in the context of the world we live in, and how quickly things change and how quickly time is moving. And so she struggled with that, and when she was writing Crudo, and in a sense wrote that sort of mix of fiction, non-fiction, slightly fragmented style as well. And so I feel like Salena Godden is likewise trying to find a form of how to tell the stories she wants to tell, which is to honour and remember people who have not always been remembered in history, who've been erased from history, including the Grenfell Towers, for example. And I think she does that really beautifully. The poetry is amazing, and whilst it didn't entirely work for me, I think it's exciting. So I love it for that. So that was Mrs. Death. I am going to go now. Let me know what you've been reading. I will see you soon. Bye for now.